not to happen in a position where black plays e6, white has to play knight f3. Now the reason why we have to play knight f3, because on d5 we play c takes d, ed, and now we go to Tarash, and on cd we can capture on d4 with the knight. So the black's trick is when they go e6 and we go knight f3, there goes, now white did not develop bishop on g2, there is their opportunity to play b6, bishop g2, bishop b7. And now when we castle, there is d6 or bishop e7, and this is completely different position. Now this is not English anymore, this is variety of ready opening. So there are two ways to play this position for white. One of them is d4, cd, queen takes d4, which is very playable, and there are many games with it. White is little better always. Black, what black does, they go d6, knight d7, and they create so-called hedgehog position. But the one I would recommend you to play, and it's very interesting way to play also, is b3 castle, bishop b2, and after d5 we go e3. Now this is a tricky way to play. What white wants is, white does not want to give black a center, or actually after cd knight takes d5, and black has no problems. They want to stop d4. e3 does stop d4. Now d4 is not good move because ed, cd, knight takes knight goes to b5, and d4 pawn becomes weak. So white goes e3, and after knight c6, queen to e2, and the common way to play for black is d takes c, b takes c, a6, and then white goes d3, queen c7, and this position is very well known. I like this position very good. Actually, one of the best games I ever won in my whole chess career was with this opening. White goes knight e1, this is the plan, and after black goes rook d8, for example, now f4, and what we're trying to do, we try to go g4, g5, for example, rook b8, then g4, and bishop a8. Black tries to get the counterplay with b5. Then we go g5, and after knight d7, maybe knight f3, and knight e4. You see, you try to increase the function of the b2 bishop, and eventually white may get very dangerous attack on a king side, because all pieces, even before we go knight f3, maybe rook f3 and rook h3, white can slowly build very dangerous attack on a black's king side. So this is another suggestion, another opportunity, another plan. This in order to avoid the hedgehog positions by black. Now about the move order. When c4 and c5, we talked about knight c3 positions, each one way. But now, more ambitious way to plan a second move, knight f3, to fight for initiative in the earlier stage of the game. And here is what I mean by that. Knight f6, g3, e6. Now after e6, here is what happens. If we go knight c3, then we have position with so-called hedgehog, and one we just described, bishop g2, bishop b7, castle, and then later b3 and e3. But also the other way to play for white, which is also very ambitious way to play. In this position, d4 move. C takes d, knight takes d4, and d5. This is one of the continuations for black. And actually, the other move is bishop to b4 check. Now let's go with both of them. Let's look at both of them. Interesting position after d5. Bishop g2 and e5. White goes knight f3 and black goes d4. Black tries to establish comfortable pawn center. Obviously, knight takes e5 loses to queen a5 check, followed by queen takes e5. So after d4, black castles, white castles. Black goes knight c6, white goes e3. This is very well-known position in theory, and theory thinks the position is okay for black. Actually, it's very interesting, the evaluation of this variation, actually evolution of this variation. Bishop e7 was played for many years, and it was considered as very very playable and very stable position for black, and that was refuted later. Here is how. E takes d, e takes d, and this is maybe biggest blunder and biggest lapse in the opening theory, in the history of any opening. E takes d, I tell you what I mean. E takes d, knight d2, castle, knight b3, and in this position, black has a problem with d4 pawn, which after d3 gives them very good position. So d2, white played bishop f4, black castled. This game was played on the highest level between two candidates for world championship. Black castled, knight e5, knight takes e5, and bishop takes e5. Bishop to c5, knight to d2, knight to g4. Actually, since the game was played on the highest level, everybody believed in the credibility of this continuation, and there were several games that ended in an early draw in this position. Knight g4, bishop f4, and now white has powerful threat of knight b3, but after knight e3, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, white's knight is hanging on d2, and knight cannot move because of e2 check, winning white's queen. White played king h1, and game ended in a draw after e takes d. However, this position was known as equal and drawn until many years later. Soviet or Russian Grandmaster Polugaevsky noticed that this position is totally lost for black. Queen h5 is a winning move. Here is the simple proof of it. If e takes d, then queen takes c5 with extra piece, and if e2 check, then white simply plays rook to f2, and bishop takes f2, king takes f2. Later white is going to pick up the e2 pawn, and they have two minor pieces for queen with winning position. And it's amazing that such a simple continuation was missed on the highest level, and no one later found refutation of it. And the explanation is very simple. Today it cannot happen because everything you work on and everything you discover and everything you invent, you have a luxury of checking on a computer on the playing program. So queen h5 is a losing move. So that shattered a little bit the evaluation, and black had to go to a drawing board, and black had to find some other way to play this position. After knight c6 castle, black, after castle knight c6, white played e3, and black came up with a continuation of bishop c5. E takes d, e takes d, and this position was again, once more, in many games used by black and proven as very solid for black, because on rook e1 check, black would go knight g5, would go knight e6, and on bishop e6, and on knight g5 they castle, and if knight takes e6 fe, it's very dangerous for white to win the e-pawn, because after d3, you see there is a target on f2 and possible knight d4 move, and white may be in a serious danger here. So this pawn cannot be taken, and so black will comfortably castle and have a good position, but it's not so. Knight d2, that was played in my game. I played knight d2. This move gives a white serious advantage. Castle, knight b3, queen b6, and this was all analyzed. It said black is in a good health here, but there is no health here at all, much less a good health. This position is bad, real bad for black. Bishop g5 is the move that completely troubles black here. After bishop g5, black has a very bad game. Now, what to do with the knight on f6? There are two moves. One of them is knight e4. Well, actually, it's only one move, knight e4, and the other is bishop e7, which is a lot weaker because of c5, and d4 pawn becomes weak. So move is knight e4, and now white goes rook e1. Black has two moves again, bishop f5 or knight takes g5. Bishop f5 is not very pleasant because of knight h4, and now black is forced to play knight takes g5 and knight takes f5. Very bad position. You can take my word for it, or you can ask for assistance from your computer program. So in this position, after knight h4, black has trouble. So they have to play knight takes g5, knight takes g5. And now they have a problem. What is the next move? The threat is very obvious. The threat is knight takes h7, king takes h7, followed by queen h5 check, and picking up the bishop on c5. Black has serious problem. Move h6 is one move, and move bishop f5 the other move. They are both very bad. h6 loses to knight takes f7. If king takes f7, then queen h5 check simply wins the bishop on c5. And if rook takes f7, then after bishop d5, black has no defense at all. The threat is simple. Bishop takes f7, king takes f7, queen h5 check, winning the bishop. Let's see what possible defense is. On bishop f8, white wins immediately by playing bishop takes f7, king takes f7, queen f3, king g8, and rook e8. Bishop on f8 cannot be protected, since after queen b4 white simply plays c5 and black can resign here. So that's all for h6 move. Actually, the only move here is bishop e7, which gives white a good advantage after either knight f3 or knight e4. The other move can be played is bishop f5, and it looks very good for black. Looks like they can go h6. They have two bishops, and knight on g5 looks silly, but this is lost for black. After bishop takes c6, it doesn't matter which way black recaptures, and rook e5 attacking two bishops. And only way not to lose a piece is queen f6, rook takes c5, queen takes g5, and knight takes d4, and black is completely busted. They have to go g6. Since on rook d8 simply rook takes f5, they have to go g6, and after knight takes f5, gf, and queen f3, there is not much play left for black here. So this is another very solid continuation for black. That's how it was known anyway, is completely refuted. So that's not a good way to play for black. So let's get to this position again, how we got this. It doesn't matter, knight f6, knight f3, c5 is just simple transposition. Now we go g3, e6, d4, cd, knight takes d4, and d5. After bishop g2, e5, knight f3, d4, castle, knight c6, and e3. Again, bishop e7 we looked at, and bishop c5 we looked at. If in both cases white has clear advantage, then what's left for black to play? d3 move was popular at some point, but I don't think it's a good move. After knight c3, there are a lot of games being played. e4, for example, it looks very good. e4 and d3 pawns are very strong, but after knight d2, e4 pawn will be lost. Black is not developed. They can't afford to move pawns that far, to advance pawns that far, because development means something. These pawns can be lost. So I don't know what's a good way to equalize for black, if there is any way to equalize for black. So what is left here, what we have to look is another continuation in this position, and the position I'm talking to is c4, c5, knight f3, knight f6, g3, e6, d4, cd, knight takes d4. And now move is the bishop b4 check. Now after bishop b4 check, we will go bishop d2. And here black plays queen b6, and the interesting move is bishop g2. That's what we play here. And if black plays bishop takes d2 check, then queen takes d2 without any problem. And if black plays knight c6, then we simply go e3. And there is still no, a knight takes d4, we go ed. And this is also very satisfactory continuation for white. That will pretty much cover the English part of our opening. That means when black plays c5 or e5. Now let's talk about those departures from English or deviations for black that white can face. On c4, when black plays c6 or e6, followed by d5. Now on c4 and c6, you have several ways you can play this position, and one of them is e4. which after d5, ed, cd, and d4 will get you pawn of attack of Caro-Kann. And if you're comfortable with it, of course you can play it. The other continuation is d4, and after d5, just to play Slav defense. If you know, if you have some variation that you like, you're gonna play it. If not, let me suggest you quickly some continuation. C takes d, c takes d, knight c3, knight c6, knight f3, and knight f6, bishop f4. And here basically I'm gonna quickly run through this variation because it's not part of the English opening, and we don't want to go into big details of it. But after bishop f4, you can pick up the material from here, actually from my encyclopedia DVDs. And on bishop f4, black has basically two continuations, a6 and bishop f5. a6 becomes more and more popular lately. On a6 you can go knight e5, and if black plays bishop d7 or e6, you can simply go e3, bishop d3, and have a slight advantage. And if black after bishop f4 plays symmetrical bishop f5, e3, e6, bishop b5, rook c8, and on queen a4, knight d7. This is very well known position. In my opinion, black has no equality here, because after bishop takes c6, rook takes c6, queen takes a7, queen c8. This is all theory. Actually, for some reason, this position is regarded as equal position and white has no advantage, which I absolutely don't agree with. Now black has a threat of rook takes c3 and also rook to a6, trapping queen. White's only move is queen a5, and if black goes rook a6, then queen c7, black goes queen a8, and now they want to capture the queen by playing rook c6, and white can simply castle in this position. Actually, this position I like for white very much, because possible rook c6 in this position can be met by knight b5 with the idea of queen takes c6 followed by knight c7 check, and obviously black cannot capture white's queen. White has very good position here. Those are kind of couple of guidelines what area you can conduct your researches on. So, but the variation, the way I like to play most on c4, c6 is knight f3 move, because after knight f3, d5, g3, knight f6, and bishop g2, this is position that this is the opening that was not explored properly, and I have pretty good idea, and actually I'm almost convinced that white has some advantage here. There are several ways to play this position, and DC is one of them, and actually this is the only principal continuation. If black does not play DC, then what white would want to do is to castle and go b3, and if black plays bishop f5, for example, what you can do is play c takes d, c takes d, and queen to b3, attacking b7 pawn. I can assure you that if black plays queen b6, this position is definitely better for white. It's better because queen takes to b6, a takes b, knight c3, e6, and now you have to go d3, and after knight c6, possibly bishop e3, or even castle, followed by knight h4, or rook e1 and e4. We don't want to go into big details of it, but if you like to spend some time on it, you will be convinced that white does have some advantage. Now let's talk about the position after queen b3 if black does not want to play queen b6. If they play, for example, queen c7 or queen c8, then we go knight c3, e6, castle, knight c6, d3, bishop e7. This position is also not very good for black. First of all, white can go knight h4 and get the light square bishop. Secondly, they can play rook e1 followed by e4. In both cases with some advantage for white. Also, they could go bishop f4 and after castling rook c1. You see white is better here. Knight b5 is a threat and on possible e6, knight a4, white has upper hand. Now, suppose black does not play bishop f5, and what are the choices we are facing then? In this position, black can play d takes c. And here is what we want to do here. Move I like very much is knight a3. After d takes c and knight a3, bishop e6 is the main move. We go knight g5, and here black has two main continuation. There is move bishop d5, and there is very complicated move that happened a couple of times on high level, bishop g4. That was move was played by Torre, Filipino Grandmaster Torre, and he played very good game. He won with black against Viktor Korchnoi, and the game became very popular and very famous. But then a couple of days after that, I played this game against Torre myself with white, and I was proud, I completely refuted this move for white. Let's see what happened. But before we go into these continuations after knight g5, bishop g4, before we go into details of it, let's look at bishop d5 move that gives white clear advantage. After e4, black has to go h6, e takes d, h takes g, d takes c, knight takes c6, knight takes c4, and black has to go e6. This is a very bad position for black. Let me show you why. Move is queen a4. Now, what is a threat? And bishop e7 is a losing move, not because white can win a pawn, because I'm not that sure this is very good to win pawn like this, because white has a lot of squares on light squares, and besides, bishop on c1 is badly placed. But bishop e7 is bad because of white's knight a5. This is very powerful move. Now if black castles, white can simply win by playing knight takes b7. Otherwise, knight takes c6 is threatening, and queen takes a5 loses to bishop takes c6 check, and white wins a queen. Black is in big trouble. The way to avoid immediate trouble, black may try knight d5, but then we play knight to e3. And now black has two choices, either go bishop e7 or take on e3 and go bishop e7 or rook c8. But then white has bishop d2, bishop c3. White has pair of very strong bishops and next to winning position. However, if black tries to play simple bishop e7, then after knight takes d5, ed, and when both sides castle, white can go simply d3, and you see bishop on g2 is very powerful with a weak pawn on d5 for black and very difficult position. Now let's go back now to the move. Bishop g4. That's the key move of the whole variation that was regarded as good for black for some time. So after knight a3, bishop is on e6, white went knight g5, bishop to g4, and now simply knight takes c4 and knight b to d7. Now what is black's idea? Black thinks that white misplaced the knight on g5, and knight on c4 is not going to stand too long. Black can go knight b6, and black is doing very fine. However, after queen to b3 and knight c5, I went queen to e3, and all of a sudden we see it's very unusual position for the queen on e3, and all of a sudden you see black has serious problems. So what happened after queen to e3? I have to point that after knight to c5, after knight c5 is the only move because white is threatening queen takes b7 as well as knight d6 check, followed by queen takes f7 checkmate. So black's knight c5 move is forced, and after queen to e3, e6, protecting the knight on c5. Now knight takes f7. This is the key of whole white's maneuver. King takes f7, knight to e5, king to e8, and b4. Now why b4? Because we have to remove knight from c5. If black goes knight d7, then knight takes g4 simply wins for white, because after knight takes g4, queen takes e6, and white takes the knight on g4 next move, having two extra pawns and easily won game. So in the position on the board here with knight on c5, black must go knight d5, and that's exactly what happened. After queen d4, knight takes b4. All those moves are very much forced. Knight takes b4, and now white cannot take the knight on b4 because of knight d3 check, and black wins white's queen. So the move is queen takes g4, knight c2 check, king to d1, knight takes a1. Black has an extra rook, but after queen h5 check, g6 is absolutely forced move, since after king e7 blacks get mated by knight c4. So g6 is forced, knight takes g6, h takes g, and queen takes h8, trapping the knight on e1. a1. Actually, that's what happened in a game, and after white captured black's knight on a1, black is totally lost with a pawn down and bad position. Now this is interesting variation, an interesting way to play. I'm a big fan of this variation, and I had a lot of my own analysis and inventions in in this opening, which is c4, c6, knight f3, d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2. Again, quick summary: d takes c, knight a3 is bishop e6 is one move. Now there are only a couple of other continuations in this position. One is, what if black simply goes g6, then knight takes c4, and after bishop g7 we castle, black castles. Now I played this position several times. This is very good position for white. There is no concrete variations. I just show you the plan. Plan is only one plan that you can play here if you want to get an advantage. It's put the pawn on d3. That's what white does. Well, black's move won't make much difference in white's plan. Then you go rook to b1, followed by bishop d2 and pawn on b4, and try to push b5 in. And if black plays knight b6 at some point, do not exchange the c4 knight and put it on a5. Knight on a5 is going to put substantial pressure on b7 and c6 squares, and followed by b5 next, or queen c2 and rook c1. White has very good play on the queen side. I had a couple of games played like this, and I won them both against grandmasters, and I am convinced that's a very good position for white. And finally, I want to show you what happens if black simply wants to hold on to an extra pawn by playing b5. What happens then? Okay, well, what I would recommend here after knight a3, b5 is to go d3. On white, black plays c takes d, then knight to e5. Now this is an interesting continuation. Now knight e5 threatens knight takes c6, and maybe knight takes b5. Black's best move here, bishop to b7. And now I gotta point this to you, that knight takes b5 loses for white because of queen to a5 check, winning the knight on b5, and if knight goes to c3, then winning the knight on e5. But what we will do here, after bishop to b7, we simply castle, or maybe even play knight takes d3. Now when black goes e6, we simply castle, then go bishop e3, rook c1. Notice that knight takes b5 is hanging, and black has to go a6. Then queen c2, knight c5, and white has substantial play, very good play for a deficit of a pawn, and they have very strong initiative. So those are the basic ideas of this departure from regular English, and that will turn into a ready opening. Now the other way to play for black to depart from English is e6. What I would recommend here, we cannot stop black's d5, so I would recommend to go to the Queen's Gambit declined. We'll go knight c3. Of course you can go knight f3, d5, d4 and play Catalan, which is okay, but simple way is d4, and after d5, knight c3, knight f6, c takes d, e takes d, bishop g5, bishop e7, e3, and after c6, bishop d3, and castle. Here I don't want to spend much time on it. I'll just tell you this: you can pick up material on this opening where white has some advantage from various different publications, from different encyclopedias or online databases, online games or databases of big tournament. White can go knight f3 or knight e2. It's a matter of taste, and in both cases white gets some advantage. So that's how would you play against various departures when black does not want you to play English opening. But again, what you have to do is you have to know you have to have minimal knowledge of concrete variations, but good, very good understanding of basic positional ideas. Once you do that, and once you master on it, you're going to have yourself good and solid one opening repertoire, which is one opening that can turn in a few others. Like it's the shortest opening repertoire you can have for white, and maybe one of the safest ones. So I would strongly recommend you to follow to this advice and playing